2 weeks and this is gonna go. So as the country starts to move into somewhat of a normal lifestyle, I thought I would spend a little bit of time reflecting on the last 3 months working in the NHS. To help with a few of the things that I talk about, we're going to use 2 models. The first one is, it's had so many different references, I find it hard to keep up. It's a managing complex change matrix, and we'll go by the original citee, who was Lippitt. The second model is Kubler-Ross's change curve. Now, this is often related to things like grief, but the stages can definitely be related to any change and how we react as human beings to that change. So we all know that going through any element of change in our life is complicated and it's fraught with its own difficulties. Now, within the NHS, we are constantly conscious of striving towards making change better for everybody involved. So when I've done previous change modules at university or gone on online courses, when I use those models and I try to reflect back on how we've been going through COVID and the pandemic, if I was to draw a graph of the peaks and the troughs, it would be like any other change curve known to history. And I think that's probably got something to do with the confusion around either that guidance from the government based on the science that they have at the time. That's forever changing, and therefore the more that we learn, the more changes happen, which is a good thing. Without change, we will just continually go through the same errors and never learn. So, as you know, I am a senior manager within the NHS. I have a team, and that team is made up of multiple different work streams. Within those work streams, there can be either one person or up to 6 people per work stream. So going through this change management of working through this pandemic with my team has been complicated. Literally the days before the pandemic was announced, I was working through something that had been on my to-do list for many, many months, and my manager and her manager were asking me when it would be done. Needless to say, it still is not done. But that project was looking at our work streams and looking at the quality assurance frameworks around what we do and demonstrating the impact that that work has on the workforce, and therefore the care that that workforce are able to deliver at the bedside in the clinical environments. So part of that work for me was bringing about a change of how we worked as teams. I was looking at different ways of getting the team together, away days, mini team meetings, shaping things up slightly to start to embed some of that change in how we worked together. Then COVID hit. Within the NHS, and I'm sure within many different organisations, we have a thing called major incident planning. Now, when there is a major incident declared within the organisation, many different people at different senior levels are given different roles to play. Now, when the NHS as a total goes into a pandemic, that's slightly more complicated because there are different people within different organisations having different roles. It's all designed to make sure that everybody does what they need to do and they get the information at the point at which they need it. With this pandemic, our information was being led by NHS England and the government. That information changed on a daily basis. Sometimes within a couple of hours, the information would change again. Now, that's not any poor planning of their part, that's just the situation that we were in. So when we begin to look at the first stage of the model for managing complex change, the first part is vision. Now, because we're not traditionally bringing in a change, but we are going through a change, I needed to make sure that that change was managed appropriately within my team and the wider hospital. So that first section, vision, that was the hardest. The crux of it was the vision is to keep everybody safe, both patients, public, and also teams and members of staff within the organisation. So part of that plan was to redeploy people back home, working from home to Shield. Part of that plan was to redeploy some of our staff back into the clinical environment and external to some of the bigger organisations dealing with the adult population that obviously COVID mainly affected. Now, going back to the major incident planning, once the major incident within the trust was declared, my director at the time was put into the Silver Command. I was part of the Bronze model within our team, and we would meet twice daily in the first instance. And those meetings were designed to make sure that the information that was coming from central government were passed into the hospitals efficiently and effectively. So it was at those points that we would leave the meeting with the vision of the day. Sometimes that vision would change in the afternoon, we'd meet again, and then we would change accordingly. But without a clear vision, you have confusion. So I needed to make sure that the teams knew exactly what we were doing and why. The second part of the model, which is skills, for us as an education department, we had the skills. Our work as part of the vision was to upskill the workforce to be able to deal with the pandemic that was coming our way. So part of the job was to upskill some of the non-clinical staff into clinical roles and to support those senior clinicians into even more senior roles where they could step into the intensive care environment and deal with those patients accordingly. As a department, we can teach, that's what we do, we were fine. However, from the model, you can see that without skills, you end up with anxiety. To be going through work with anxiety is really not a nice place to be. So it was really important for me, for my team, to make sure that everybody doing their job had the right skills to hand to deliver it. The third part of the model is incentives. For day-to-day management of change, you really do have to think about the incentives for the people in your team. When you're faced with a pandemic, there's not really much of an incentive apart from keeping safe. So when there was elements of my job to change how people worked, the incentive for them to work from home was that they were safe. There was also added benefits of limited distractions, and also maybe that project list might get a bit shorter because you can tick off some of the jobs that you've been piling up over the months. If a team doesn't have incentives when you're bringing about a change, there is resistance. Point number 4 on this model is quite important. Resources. Resources within the NHS, it's tough. I'm not talking about personal protective equipment here, PPE. I am talking, for me, specifically around laptops, technology, things like mobile phones. Within this pandemic, one of the biggest things that changed was the way that our teams were working. So they were disseminated into clinical teams where they would go out and work clinically with staff at the bedside, again, upskilling them, and also making sure that everybody was looked after pastorally. Everybody was out of the office and you can't contact anybody by then because you're not allowed your phones in the clinical environments. So how are you meant to get messages to them? All of my team were out dispersed around the hospital. Without resources, you get frustration. Frustration and anxiety were two of the biggest factors going through the COVID pandemic in our work streams. We just didn't have the resources available. We still don't have the resources available. We need extra laptops. We need extra technology to be able to deliver the teaching sessions virtually because we're not allowed to do things face to face. When we are teaching face to face, we need to be wearing PPE, and PPE is in short supply. So whichever avenue we tried to turn down to make sure that we were getting progression, it was faced with another challenge. So resources, NHS, challenging. And then the fifth point in the model is around action plans. Now, action plans was probably one of the easiest things because everything changed so rapidly every day. We were able to make sure that that information was disseminated to the team members at the right times and appropriately. However, I'm really quite hard on myself within my work, and I really wanted to make sure that everybody knew exactly what they needed to do at any moment of the day. That was probably unrealistic of me, and I put a lot of pressure on myself to make sure that my team members were happy, aware, informed, up to date, and safe. All key things really when it comes to it, but actually all together in that pandemic situation, that was really hard to do. So that's the kind of model, and those are the points that I wanted to discuss. But for me as a leader, it was really important to keep checking in with my team members, even if they were working off-site, to be able to make those decisions on-site with my team. Now, at times, I would use this matrix backwards. So if I was faced with a group of people within my team, particularly feeling quite anxious or frustrated, I would then look at that final resulting column and work my way back and see which part perhaps of that change model was missing, and then focus on really making sure that those people knew exactly what they needed to do or what the resources were that they needed, or perhaps they were teaching a skill that actually themselves they were quite rusty at. So really needs to make sure that my team were happy and they had the skills to deliver. Now, nobody's life outside of work is perfect, and for me as a leader, it's really important for me to keep that in the forefront of my mind, even on a day-to-day basis without the pandemic that is going on outside, but even more so importantly for me to make sure that everybody was happy coming into work, or happy working at home, or maybe if there were people within my team leaving family, friends behind, come into work, I needed to make sure that I was touching base with them to just allow me that bit more of an insight into what's going on within their world, to hopefully start to reduce some of that frustration and anxiety for them. And this is a point I mentioned in my last video regarding getting to know your team. I think, like everybody, we've all changed through this pandemic, and we will always continue to change through what's to come. So I feel like it's still really important for me to make sure that my team feel like I'm interested, I'm available, and I'm visible. Now, throughout all of my senior roles, I've had coaching. I've had professional coaching from outside of the organisation, from people who aren't nurses. So that's been really quite interesting for me to see their viewpoints on some of the aspects that I struggle with. Part of the latest set of coaching, I completed what's called a DISC profile. This profile, it's a personality test in a way to help understand who you are as a person. From completing the test, I came out as an SC, which means that my main elements of my personality are steady and conscientious, which basically means that I like to be supportive for people, but I also work quite accurately, and I'm a bit of a speedy perfectionist. I want everything done and it needs to be perfect, which it's never going to happen. And one of the things that I was going through coaching for was to really bring up my driver side, the D part of DISC. Now, as a leader, you feel like you need to be somewhat of an inspiring individual, but you do also need to be driving forward too. It's something that I've struggled with, but I really do think that through this pandemic, that is one of the biggest things that I have achieved and developed in, is my ability to drive a team and to really be a leader in that. And I really feel that that is something that I'm most proud of. And I do think it's equally important to look at these times where we are all struggling, both physically and mentally, and really pick up on the points that actually I've developed that, I've changed that in my life, and I feel better for it. So through this pandemic, people's lives will have changed permanently in many areas, possibly, hopefully for the better. But I really have enjoyed looking back over these times and seeing where I've developed more personally, but also professionally, and trying to celebrate that as one of the good things that's come out of this pandemic. I do believe that it's a really great task to reflect back on any time of change, especially at the moment going through this world pandemic, and seeing the areas of our lives that have adapted, changed, developed, enhanced, maybe got worse in some areas. I have definitely put weight on, but I think through that reflection, really highlight the bits that you're most proud of and see how it's helped you for the better. I hope you enjoyed my video on my perception of things over the last few months, and let's see what happens in the coming months. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.